I'm Lawrence Francis, host of Interpreting Wine, welcoming you to a special episode focusing on the WSET Diploma D3, D4 and D5 theory exams. Today, McHale MW covers the 7 most commonly made exam mistakes based on her extensive analysis of the most recent examiner's report. Anne describes examples of mistakes taken from past papers and gives tips on how to address each of these mistakes. As you may know, Anne runs a coaching program to support students prepare for the D3, D4 and D5 theory exams called Diplomatherapy, and I have partnered with Anne to offer 4 exclusive bonuses for Interpreting Wine listeners who sign up to Diplomatherapy in 2023. To learn more about this special offer, head to interpretingwine.com/D3help. Enjoy.
So for those who don't know me, I'm a Master of Wine. I'm actually celebrating my 10th anniversary later this year, which is very exciting. Before I became an MW, I was myself an award-winning diploma graduate. I've been a diploma educator for 6 years and also a certified WSET educator for the past 11 years. So I'm talking to you today about the 2022 Examiner's Report, specifically looking at the D3, D4 and D5 theory exams from January to June 2022. And we'll be looking at the top mistakes that people make in these exams. So I thought it might be interesting to start, just to put everything in context, with some statistics for you regarding the diploma theory exams. The pass rates in 2022 for the D3, D4 and D5 modules ranged from 76%, which was the D5 paper in June, to as low as 50% for D3 theory, which was in February. So you can't actually separate out the tasting and theory results for D4 and D5. So the theory could even have been lower than that high of 76%. And based on the comments, it certainly was, at least for the D4 exam in January. But if we just take the available statistics, that is still a shocking 24 to 50% of smart, qualified, high-level wine industry professionals and wine lovers who are getting this bad news in their inbox, despite the fact that I know from all the coaching I've done that these candidates are committed and motivated to succeed. So why are these pass rates not higher? It's all in how you prepare for these exams and, very crucially, how you avoid the most commonly made mistakes when you are actually in the exams. Now, at this point, listeners, you may wish to pause the recording and make sure that you have in front of you the examiner's report for these 2022 exams up until June. If you don't have these in front of you, it might not be as easy to follow what I'm doing because I'll be referencing the questions and I'll be running through the top 7 mistakes with tips on how to fix each mistake. A lot of this advice you will recognize if you have listened to my previous appearance on the podcast, but it never hurts to hear it again. And the examples are, of course, different. I have also included D4 and D5 this time because the advice for D3 applies equally to those as well. Now, it is worth pointing out that they don't actually include the D4 and the D5 questions in the reports. So we will still be focusing more on D3, but I will be making reference to D4 and D5 because you can have a guess at what the questions might have been from what the examiners say in the report. Let's dive straight in then to mistake number 1. This is not respecting the marking weightings given. And this is a frequently commented upon mistake in the diploma theory examiners reports. In 2022, it appeared a couple of times. I'll give you one example. That's in the context of the D3 February question 6 on Burgundy. So here you were supposed to write equally on 3 subregions. But yet they said that even though this is a core part of the D3 syllabus, many candidates wrote short and generic answers for the section on say. And it happens again and again throughout the report. So how do you fix this mistake? Now, of course, sometimes you may have no choice but to write less in one of the sections, because sometimes we quite simply cannot recall enough detail, and that happens to everyone. But in many cases, people disrespect the weightings simply because they don't plan their time properly. So apart from making sure that you write on questions that you know about, you can fix mistake number 1 by doing this as well. First of all, practice time management in advance. So my suggested technique for this is to attempt a past exam question open, i.e. with reference to the book, so that you can gather together all the material and write the answer according to the correct weightings. Then a week or so later, rewrite the answer under exam conditions and check afterwards that you have respected the weightings. And the more you practice this, the more natural it will become under pressure. If you want to get really accurate, do a few calculations in advance of how long you should spend on each part of the questions using the most commonly appearing weightings. So basing this on 35 minutes per question in a D3 exam, which would allow 5 minutes for planning and checking. If the weighting is a 60-40 split like the D3 May question 2 on Alsace, calculate 60 and 40%, so that would be 21 minutes and 14 minutes. Calculate a few of the other commonly appearing weightings. Make sure you have these in your mind, jot them down when you're making your plan in the exam. Keep an eye on your timer and just make sure that you move on to the next section at the right time. It does take a little bit of preparation, this, but it will be really helpful for you in the exam just to be really strict with yourself. Of course, in other cases, people simply don't pay attention to the weightings. So make sure you take proper note of them and write roughly the amount of detail corresponding to each one. I always find that it's a terrible waste if someone fails a question not because they didn't know the material, but because they didn't pay enough attention to these weightings. Mistake number 2. This is where you only rely on the D3, D4 or D5 material to answer the question, or you rely too much on the D1 and D2 material to answer the question, and particularly the case with D1. So it's really important that you know that a holistic grasp of D1 and D2 is required to succeed at D3, D4 and D5. And the examiners frequently comment on students not having prepared all of the modules. In the 2022 report, this was mentioned in the comments on the D3 February question 7 on New Zealand, so Hawke's Bay and Central Otago. And they explicitly say there, examiners advise candidates to revisit the D2 materials as part of their preparation. And again, when they comment on May question 6 on Rioja, they say candidates who had revised the D2 unit were likely to do better as they could apply generic principles of branding and apply them in context. And they also allude to it on a couple of other occasions throughout this report, where they imply that there was not enough business knowledge. So for instance, in the February D3 question 1 on Argentinian Malbec, they say there was not enough reference to brand Malbec in terms of both the on and off trade. And this is an example of where your general business understanding from D2 could have informed this answer. Likewise, in question 4, also from February, where the section on trade structures in Washington and Oregon appeared, you could have used D2 content to comment on scales of production, ownership models, and routes to market. Then in the January D5 paper, they were unimpressed by the lack of commercial understanding of developments in the port market. Again, if you have absorbed and understood your D2 content, you could apply it to a D5 question like this that has a commercial angle. I've generally noticed throughout the examiner's reports as well that candidates are expected also to expand a little on the D3, D4 and D5 material. And that could be by extrapolating using concepts from D1 or D2 or from extra reading. And my advice for that is that you start with the additional links included in the material. If you have time and if you're very, very committed to getting a distinction in the exam, then you should take that further with other books or online trade articles, for example, from the drinks business. Going back to this idea of, using D1 and D2 to inform your understanding of D3, D4, and D5, there is, at the other end of the spectrum, there's a risk that you could take this too far and rely only on these because you've forgotten all the detail from the other modules. A lot of people, I have noticed, over-rely on D1 in particular. So again, to use that Malbec question as an example, the examiners say that too many candidates offered generic comments on factors such as winemaking and microclimates, which, whilst not incorrect, needed to be more specifically applied to illustrate a full understanding of the topic. And then in question 7 on New Zealand, they said that there were too many generic statements that were not linked back to specific regions. So how do we fix this mistake? Of course, this is easier said than done, but the key method for preventing this mistake is to allocate plenty of time to your studies for these exams so that you can comprehensively cover and learn as much as possible from the material, including clicking on the extra links, ideally, as well as leaving time in your study plan for a solid review of your D1 and your D2 notes, always making links between all the materials where you can. Mistake number 3 is not structuring your answers logically. This is a frequent complaint of the examiners, and the 2022 report is no exception. So for instance, in the D3 February question 1 on Malbec, they say candidates should clearly offer lines of demarcation for their answers. So you need to be really crystal clear in how you lay out each section of your answer. They actually said that for this question, many answers were presented as one long block of text. Try to imagine yourself in the examiner's shoes. Okay, you have hundreds of scripts to mark. They're all handwritten with varying degrees of legibility. And if you get one that is just a big block of text, it's going to be very hard for you to decipher whether or not that answer is addressing the question. Okay, so structure is really important. Likewise, in the D3 February question 7, so that one on Hawke's Bay and Central Otago, a useful example is given by the examiners regarding how to achieve a higher score using logical structure. So the question asked for comparisons between Hawke's Bay and Central Otago in terms of their growing environment and winemaking for red wines specifically. The examiners note that the compare part of the question was more directly addressed when candidates chose the structure of first looking at growing environment and then looking at the two regions within that, and then looking at winemaking and then the two regions within that. If you had taken each region in turn, as you might be tempted to do by glancing at the question, that would have led you to a more descriptive and less comparative approach. And we'll be talking about that again when we look at mistake number 6. So how do you fix mistake number 3? The examiners actually do give us a clue, because they say in the feedback for this Malbec question, the first one I talked about, that the answer can mirror the structure of the question. And they often give clues to the structure in the question itself. So if we look at the D3 February question 2 on strengths and weaknesses of the Loire, that is a very simple structure to follow, and you often get strengths and weaknesses questions appearing. And I would just advise always sticking to one section on strengths and one on weaknesses. Or there's an example of a more complex one in the D3 May question 7 on Rioja. So the question is, what are the advantages and disadvantages of producing and marketing Rioja by age category, geographical delimitations, and brand? So this actually ends up as a kind of 12-part structure. So first of all, you've got the advantages of producing by age category, then the disadvantages of producing by age category. Then you've got the advantages of marketing by age category, then the disadvantages, etc. But you would be in a position where, because that's kind of laid out in the question, you could very clearly delineate that with subheadings in your answer and make it very clear for the examiner. So my advice would be, If they have given you a structure, by all means use it. I also have a slightly counterintuitive piece of advice regarding structure, and I really hope this is going to be kind of revelatory and helpful for you. So if you look through all the past questions, many of them follow the classic format of how does X influence Y? So for instance, from the 2022 exams, the question from D3 February number 3, and I am paraphrasing here, by the way, so please make sure you check out the full question. The question was, paraphrased, it was, explain how production methods influence red wines in Piemonte. And then there was a question in May, question 3 as well, explain how production methods influence the wines of Friuli, Venezia, Giulia. And the more you look, the more of this type of question you will see. I find that students are tempted with this question format to dive straight in to talking about the production methods because it's the production methods that appears first in the question. But counterintuitively, it actually makes for a clearer structure if you start with the second part. So you outline the styles and quality levels produced first to give the reader a clear context. And then you talk about what methods have led to those styles and qualities. This would also work in the second part of question 2 from the D3 May exam on Alsace. So the second part of the question is explain how the noble varieties can be used to produce wines of differing styles and quality levels in the region. So if I were doing this, I would start by outlining the styles and quality levels, so different sweetness levels, talking about Vendange Tardive, SGN, etc. Then I would talk about AOC Alsace versus Grand Cru. And then I would go back to looking at how the 4 noble varieties can be used to produce these different styles and quality levels. So I really hope that that gives you listeners something to think about and practice. And as always, practice is key, and I mentioned this with mistake number 1. So if you use the same tip that I mentioned for helping you with marking weightings, that will help you with structure as well. So write answers to as many past questions as you can. First of all, with no time limit and looking at the materials, paying very careful consideration to the logic of your structure, making sure you're addressing any of these command verbs in the question, like the word compare, and then redo your answer a short while later under timed conditions. And in the exam itself, as well as in any timed answers that you do as practice, planning is key. So use whichever method works for you. Some people like mind maps, some people like bullet points, but do spend 3 to 5 minutes drawing up a brief plan of your answer structure before you start writing. I used to be an essay marker for MW students, so I, know more than anyone that when a clear structure is laid out for the reader, that candidate stands out very positively in that big pile of handwritten scripts that an examiner is looking through. So it really is worthwhile putting your energy into this. Mistake number 4 is not including the right amount of detail in your answer. I know that this is a major area of concern for D3 candidates in particular, since for that module there is such a huge amount to cover. My interpretation of this 2022 report, as with previous examiners' reports, is that the examiners are broadly in line with what I teach in Module 6 of my Diplomatherapy course, and that's where I cover exactly how much detail you need to extract and learn from the online book. So here are a few themes and examples that I've gathered from the 2022 reports. So first, and Lawrence, I made this comment in our last discussion, I would advise students to remember that in the D3 theory exam, you are able to omit one question in each paper. So choose it carefully. So that Burgundy question that we touched upon from 2022, the one where people wrote generic amounts of detail about Puy Frisé, you may think that you ought to answer a question like that because Burgundy is such a core topic. But if you have patchy knowledge on Puy Frisé, then that's one where you might want to reconsider and go for a question where, broadly speaking, you can do about 80% of it rather than just 2/3 of it. This point also overlaps with mistake number 2, this idea of not having a holistic grasp of D1, D2, D3, D4, and D5, and this idea of relying too much on D1 and D2. So I've already commented on that February D3 question 7, the one on New Zealand. There they said that there were too many generic statements that were not linked back to specific regions. So that comes up again in the context of this mistake. And then in the D4 January exam, they also talk about many answers seeming rushed and lacking length and depth. You've also got to be careful of not omitting really obvious detail. So in the February D3 question 2 on the Loire's strengths and weaknesses, the examiner said that a lot of key points were left out. So people were great on the stylistic diversity of the Loire, but then they didn't talk about things like climate, vintage variation, kind of obvious stuff. And this, of course, can be to do with exam pressure. So you need to find ways to deal with that terrible feeling of your mind going blank. I also mention in my Diplomatherapy program that if you are going for a distinction grade, you will need to learn plenty of detail. There is no way around it. And the examiners are always kind of hinting at that. So in the comments on the D3 February question 4 on Washington and Oregon, they say that the better candidates were able to go into considerable depth and illustrate their answers by referring to the most important AVAs within these two states. Another hint that they give is when they talk about question 4 from the D3 May exam, the question on Tokai. So they say that very few people wrote about the Forditas and Maslas categories, but, and this is the insightful part, they say, whilst not essential to gain a pass, this showed a convincing depth of knowledge of those who did. So this shows that when you are preparing for this exam, you need to have a clear goal in mind of what grade you are aiming for, because that will inform the amount of detail that you extract from the notes. So how do you fix mistake number 4? This is, of course, individual to you, your learning or your memorizing style, the grade you're aiming for, and the amount of time that you have in your life to allocate to studying. But overall, my advice for most people who do not realistically have the time to aim for a distinction would be that you have to strike a good balance between A, on the one hand, not learning all the detail from the book, so relying instead on a solid understanding of the underlying concepts. This is where your D1 and D2 comes in. But then, on the other hand, B, still extracting enough regional specific detail from the D3, D4, and D5 sections so that you can meet the examiner's requirements, as I've already talked about. And again, this is something that I help my students with inside Diplomatherapy. We also in Diplomatherapy look at tips and tricks for how you can ensure that you don't forget anything obvious. Those kinds of facts which you know that you do know, but which you can forget under exam pressure. And that would have helped, for example, with the challenges that people had on that Loire strengths and weaknesses question, where they omitted some really obvious things like climate, vintage variation, classifications, taste, and style. Mistake number 5. This would be not addressing questions on less familiar regions adequately. This is always going to be a challenge because there will usually be a question, whether it's D3, D4, or D5 theory, that includes at least one lesser known or less classic area. And in a way, it's potluck if it happens to be an area that you are more personally familiar with or which you happen to have studied more recently. So in the D3 May exam from 2022, question 3 on Friuli Venezia Giulia reminds us that in order to be well prepared for this exam, you need to have covered all the bases, even if it's not in 100% detail. So the examiner said that there were a lot of high scores on this question, but there were also a lot of very short answers from people. And they said, for whom this question was presumably the final choice on the paper, which I thought was quite a nice way of saying that they were scraping the barrel and scratching their heads with which one to plump for and ended up going for that one. They could have said that in a meaner way. So I thought that was quite nice. They also comment on this in the context of the D4 January exam, where there was a question on pearl vine. Now, it is worth pointing out that in D4 and D5, you don't get a choice of omitting any questions. Okay, so you have to have covered everything. The examiners said in the context of this question, many candidates failed to answer the question at all, suggesting that this is a part of the syllabus that some completely overlook. Likewise, if we go back to D3, the May paper from 2022, question 7 was on China, and that was the first time it had ever come up in a diploma exam. And whilst we can probably make an educated guess that means China might not come up for a while, and I'm always a bit wary of predictions like that, but we might be able to guess that. It's still clear from that it is worth preparing for these lesser known or emerging regions. Even more so, I think, because quite often there would be more leeway given in these answers. So I've noted in various pieces of commentary that I've done in the past that sometimes less analysis is required in these questions on lesser known areas. And in fact, here they even say also that for the China question, examiners did not expect candidates to name all regions as well as identify their individual climate characteristics. So it could really be worth getting a solid overview of the less classic wine regions. So how do you fix mistake number 5? Well, going back to this point again, you've got to allocate enough time in your study plan to cover the whole syllabus, even if you're not covering it to distinction level detail. You will also have to develop your memory skills. Some of us have been even maybe decades out of the education system and we haven't taken exams for a while. So you have to go back and, exercise that muscle of the memory. And we talk in Module 7 of Diplomatherapy about ways that you can do that. You also may be someone who has a very hectic work and family life and not much spare time to study. And if that's you, I advise that you extend the time before you take each exam, even if it takes you a bit longer to complete the diploma. Just give yourself that time to chip away at these exams for a longer period, because otherwise you may well end up resitting them anyway. Mistake number 6, and this is a big one, is not applying enough analysis in your answers. Diploma level theory answers require a lot of analytical skills and link making. I have actually observed that this can sometimes apply even if the wording of the question is describe or what are the characteristics of. Now, wording like that might appear to require description rather than analysis, but I would be advising you to get into the habit of making links all the time, even when that kind of wording is used. So an example would be the D3 exam from February, question 5 on Riesling. They say, describe the production of the following Riesling wines. But I would be encouraging students to nonetheless make links between the processes of production and the style and quality of the resultant wines. Simply listing and describing the processes of production would not be adequate. And although the examiners do not specifically state that here, I have spotted this pattern before in their comments, so just be aware of that. They do comment throughout the 2022 report, however, on the lack of analysis. For instance, in the June D4 exam, there was a question on Franciacorta, where they noted that very few candidates engaged with the dynamics of the question and made direct connections between grape growing inputs and stylistic outputs. Likewise, in the D5 June exam, they said for the sherry question that although knowledge of production was necessary, the focus of the question was the effect of that on the final wine character. And again, the implication here is that not enough people made these links. In most cases, the need for analysis is more clearly signposted using what are known as the command verbs. So for instance, explain how, explain why, or compare. We see an example of compare in that D3 question I mentioned earlier, that one from February, question 7 on Hawke's Bay and Central Otago. This word compare is another one that indicates the need for analysis. And so I covered in the section on structure the way in which the more successful candidates used their answer structure to draw effective comparisons between the two regions. So talking about growing environment first, and then looking at the two regions side by side within that, and then looking at winemaking, and then the two regions side by side within that. That's going to allow you to make those direct comparisons, and that is another way of meeting this requirement for analysis, the higher skill of analysis, as they call it. So how do you fix mistake number 6? First of all, my advice would be that you must revisit the document that's entitled WSET Level 4 Wines Theory Guidance, and this should be available from your APP's online classroom. And this would be to refresh your memory on what is required from each command verb and for an explanation of this higher skill of analysis. If I were to explain here what the higher skill of analysis means, I would say simply that it means stating why something is the case and making links. So, for example, links between production factors and the resultant style, quality, and price, rather than simply repeating facts. For instance, what I am doing here on this podcast is analysis. So rather than merely summarizing what the examiners have said, I have drawn out themes and I have given you my interpretation on each theme. I have then used examples to illustrate each point where possible, and I've given you my opinion on how you can improve your performance and avoid making these mistakes. That is a great example of analysis. If analysis is something that you struggle with, try always to have these questions at the forefront of your mind when you're answering a theory question. So the first question would be, why is this the case? Another question could be, what would be the consequences of this thing I've just described? And finally, what links can I make between this factor in the production and the style, quality, and price of the wine? Mistake number 7, and the final mistake I'll be discussing with you today, is not answering the question properly. This one also appears a lot in examiners' reports, and again, 2022 is no different. So for instance, in the D4 January exam, the question was on the primary functions of the Cap Classique Producers Association in South Africa, and yet many candidates instead wrote lengthy descriptions of what Cap Classique itself is, and the examiners did not like that. Then when we go to D3, in the May exam, question 1 was, why are the following 3 regions suited to the growing of Pinot Noir? And the examiners here point out that many candidates simply described the climatic conditions and environment of each of the 3 regions listed, with little or no reference to Pinot Noir. And this was not answering the question as set. They said that even though many of these candidates demonstrated excellent factual knowledge of each region, many failed to apply this successfully to the question. For example, the connection between an early ripening grape such as Pinot Noir and a cool climate needed to be explicitly explained. So this again goes back to my advice on constantly using language to show that you are making these links and employing the higher skill of analysis. In May, question 2 from D3, which was on the characteristics of the noble white grape varieties of Alsace, there's a good example here of how important it was to understand the nuance of the question. So the examiners comment that many candidates interpreted the word characteristics as requiring simply a description of a wine rather than a grape variety. Now, this criticism has come up in previous examiners' reports. So rather than writing SAT-style tasting notes, what they wanted you to do here was write about whether the variety is early or late budding, what its affinity with the soil or climate is it early or late ripening, etc. This is subtle, but it will make a difference to your performance, and it could risk leading to more of a level 3 standard of answer, which will not gain you many marks. And finally, when it comes to this mistake, it's worth pointing out that irrelevant information to fill up space is a waste of your time. You may feel at least, oh, I'm writing something, I'm not just sitting here freaking out, but it will not gain you any marks, and it will undermine the examiner's confidence in your answer. So in the January D5 exam, there was an example of this in the question about sherry production. And many candidates wrote about harvesting and maturation. They were obviously thinking, I want to write about the Solera system. I've spent ages learning it. I'm going to write about it. But it was outside the scope of the question. So you just can't get any marks for it. Mm-hmm. And then an even worse example in the D3 Alsace question from May, some people wrote about black grape varieties, even though the question specified white. And the examiners really, really don't like things like this. So please don't include any irrelevant information. And of course, the next question is, but Anne, how do I fix this mistake? Well, first, the obvious point about not answering the question properly that you must address is read the question properly. This may sound absurdly obvious, and I'm sure you've heard it before, but it is amazing how your brain can behave under exam pressure. So underline those key words in the question and keep referring back to those as you answer to make sure that you're not straying off on some random tangent. If exam pressure is something that you struggle with, and if it prevents you from thinking clearly about a question, it's worth trying to put as many measures in place as you can to help with this. And Diplomatherapy has lots of tips. As I mentioned before, make sure you create a solid plan for your answer. And at a couple of points while you're writing the answer, make sure that you sense check yourself by going back to your underlined keywords and back to your plan so that you can make sure you're not wandering off. And then I would also say don't be afraid to be obvious. Use linking and signposting language so that it is blatantly obvious to the examiner that you are answering the question by making these links that I talked about. So you may feel that this is over the top and unnecessary, but once again, I will remind you that examiners are reading hundreds of scripts. And as someone who has marked many assignments in the past, I can tell you that I tend to start by a quick scan through of the answer to check the structure and to check for clues that the question has been addressed before I then go back and read the answer in detail. So if we return to my structure tip earlier for that classic question type of how does X influence Y, you would then, by using this language, you'd always be linking X to Y in your answer. So in the question on the diversity of red wines from Piemonte, it could be the late ripening Nebbiolo grape achieves high sugar levels. This leads to high alcohol levels in the wines. In this, the phrase leads to is the linking language. So other phrases could be results in, creates, causes, is responsible for. If English is not your native language, and by the way, respect to you if you are writing this exam in your non-native language, I have huge admiration for you. But if that is the case, then you will have a little bit more work to do on building up a bank of this kind of language. My final tip for avoiding this mistake would be to review the earlier sections from the podcast on structure and analysis. These are very much interlinked with the degree to which you will answer the question properly. And particularly important are the links between production factors and, yes, you've guessed it, the style, quality and price of the wines. These links are so important, and that is why my Diplomatherapy study template encourages you to make these links at the moment when you're extracting the information from the book rather than waiting until the exam to do it. So that way you are already halfway there when it comes to making the links in the exam, and that will save you time under pressure. So these are my top tips. It's quite a lot to get your head around, But you can feel free to re-listen, of course, and do also listen to my previous episode on interpreting wine. A lot of the same content is covered, but there are a few extra nuggets in there. And of course, there I used examples from the 2021 exams. So there's a different context.
Thank you so much, Anne. I thought that was, very logically put together, and there was a, very clear progression there. And, sitting as I do somewhat outside of the exam process, it felt to me as though really a lot of those tips kind of build on top of one another, in essence, to de-risk the performance in the exam. It felt as though, when you come at this from a mistake point of view, if you could actually eliminate as many of those mistakes as possible, surely that's the end result. You're actually then setting the canvas really for you to express what you really know, for you to put in the performance that you're actually capable of. And as I say, the phrase, the term that really comes to mind for me is just that you're de-risking that exam, turning up and performing not to your ability because of what the night's sleep you had the night before, or, the journey that you had, or, some extraneous factor.
Absolutely. And, it takes a lot of preparation to do that. And it also takes an awareness of your individual strengths and weaknesses, because some people will find that, certain aspects come naturally to them and others don't. So it's really about being aware of that. And, getting support as well. So again, within my Diplomatherapy community, I support people with that. And we're actually enrolling now for the next round of Diplomatherapy. So the structure of the course is that it comprises 10 self-study modules, which teach you my complete approach for how to approach these D3, D4 and D5 exams. We cover both tasting and theory. There's probably slightly more emphasis on the theory because, as I highlighted to you, the statistics show that those are the exams that people struggle more to pass. From July through to October, we'll also have a monthly live theory masterclass for all participants. And we have many, many bonuses as well. And the most popular bonus is the dedicated private online forum, which happens in the Circle app. And that's where people can ask me their questions anytime. They can even do things like post an essay plan, and I can give feedback on whether or not it's a sensible structure, all that kind of thing. And having that support, that accountability from someone like me who's got a lot of experience in teaching this qualification, I think can be really invaluable for people, as well as the recorded content that they can go back and revisit anytime they like. There is a premium option for those who have the money to invest in private support from me as well. So I only have 3 spots available for that. But they will get my, hand holding the whole way through the theory exam process and private sessions and assignments and all that kind of thing.
Thank you so much for outlining the program, what's involved. Obviously, we'll be leaving your contact details in the show notes if anybody wants to pick up with you and find out more. In closing, what are some of the key dates, I guess, for people to keep in mind if they're interested in taking things to the next level and enrolling in Diplomatherapy?
So this round of Diplomatherapy is designed to support people in the lead up to the October and November exams. So that would be D3, D4 and D5. The focus of the program is kind of primarily on D3, but as I hope I've illustrated in the podcast today, really there's a lot of overlap between D3, D4 and D5 when it comes to theory. And in fact, tasting as well. So all of the advice that I teach in the D3 Diplomatherapy content is relevant for D4 and D5. And I'm also adding in some bonus content for those taking D4 and D5. The key date to remember, Lawrence, is that on Monday, the 3rd of July, we will be doing our first live D3 theory masterclass where we're looking in depth at one of these past questions. I will be breaking down what not to do and what to do. And people who come live will have the chance to ask me their questions live. So before Monday, the 3rd of July is when you need to get enrolled if you want to take advantage of that.
A huge thanks again to McHale MW for your time and insight today. As I'm sure you'll agree, an absolutely brilliant resource for you or anyone you know who is taking the D3, D4 or D5 exams later in October 2023 or May 2024. As mentioned, I've partnered with Anne to offer 4 exclusive bonuses for Interpreting Wine listeners who register for Diplomatherapy in 2023. Bonus 1 is the Interpreting Wine Diploma episode checklist, allowing you to access all Diploma Exam Technique podcast episodes from a single page. Bonus 2 is a private Interpreting Wine podcast feed, including all current and future Diploma Exam Technique episodes in one place. Bonus 3, a second private Interpreting Wine feed, including all regional episodes in one place. And the latest bonus number 4 is a full transcript of today's episode, allowing you to navigate directly to areas of interest. Once again, to learn more about this exclusive offer, head to interpretingwine.com/D3help, and you can also find this link in the description below. Best of luck with all of your exam prep, and I will see you next time.